Yeah, hello. I'm Elvis, and we are going to talk about the involvement of spirit on the administration of the nations of the earth. This is thrones, nations, and seers. Um, Not long ago, I talked about the word of the Lord for the nation of Israel, how that Donald Trump is going to be instrumental in the nation of Israel. He's going to help them in terms of being able to fulfill certain biblical prophecy, certain ancient prophecy that God gave to the nation of Israel. Now, in this conversation, I know that most people, when they see the title thrones, nations, and prophets, they'll be thinking that I'm talking about governmental thrones of nations. And then I would like to explain what these thrones are. But aside all, this very series that we are doing, which is going to be a platform, this, you know, show is going to be a platform where I'll be discussing certain prophetic words. On the side note, I'll be teaching on the sonship mysteries of God. When I talk about the sonship mysteries, I mean the mysteries that has to do with the manifest sons of God. In Romans 8, Paul had talked about, you see, the whole creation is waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. Now, what is the manifestation of the sons of God? The manifestation of the sons of God is the displaying of the sons of God. The sons of God are going to be used by God. They are going to be displayed by God. God is going to display himself through his sons to the nation. And that we are dealing with the works of wonder. We are dealing with the powers of the age to come that Paul had talked about in the book of Hebrews. Now, when we hear the word thrones, when you hear the word thrones, what comes to mind? Before I continue my conversation with you, I would want you to understand this thing about the manner in which I teach. Now, the way I teach is such that most of the time you'll be hearing me teaching not from the normal context that most Christians are exposed to, and it's intentional. The reason is that I've realized that people have difficulty listening. A lot of people, when they begin to hear or learn something, they are always learning within their head. That means they are learning with the limitations of what they know. That means a lot of preconceived ideas. So most of the time I mention the word angels, and all of a sudden they think I know what I'm talking about because I use the word angels. So in as much as some of the things I will be talking about is similar to what you know, you have to understand that I am not talking from your knowledge. I'm talking from my knowledge. So in order for you to really understand and not to assume me to be teaching something which I will not, which I'm actually not talking about or teaching, I would want you to try to understand me from where I'm speaking from, which means you have to be patient, not jump into conclusion, not listen with a preconceived ideas or doctrines or teachings, because when you do that, you would only be listening to yourself. And don't think I am talking or saying or talking about things that you know. I might use the word watches, but it doesn't mean it is necessarily what you think these watches or beings are. I'm coming from a kind of a unique perspective from the basis of what I've learned from the Word of God. So I would want you to humble your mind so that this very teaching would bless you, so that this very teaching would elevate your walk with God, your spirituality. So, that aside, let us go into our conversation. When I decided to talk about this whole thing about thrones and nations and seers, the first conversation that we had, I think it was more of a ranting where I began to rant about watchers. I talked about righteousness, nations, thrones, principalities. It was all mumbled together. And I'm sure most people didn't have the basis to understand the biblical basis to even understand or appreciate where I'm coming from. So in this conversation, um, in order for you to really understand the dimensions upon which the prophetic unction that God had placed on me work, it is important that I explain certain things. It is important that I teach certain things so that the delivery of certain prophetic words, it will become easy to deliver them. It will become easy to, you know, for the church or for the body of believers to be able to accept these words as from God. So it is important to understand what thrones are and what I mean when I use the word thrones, and what these things are from the Bible, from history, and other mystical texts or the other theosophical texts. Now, we have to understand this, that the nations are ruled by spirits. And this is not something that started today. This is not something that is going to end with the administration of human beings, which means that no matter the kind of administrative structure that we will set up to rule the nations, spirits are still going to rule. Spirits are still going to rule, and you have to understand this truth, because if you do not understand this truth as a believer, there are certain activity or certain working of wickedness or darkness that would take advantage of this ignorance to be able to inject into history diabolic activity. And this whole idea of the Antichrist of the last days is so much important to be understood in the light of these conversations that I'm going to have with you. And you're going to finally understand your role as a believer in this, and our role as manifest sons of God, called by God to demonstrate the government of God on this earth. Now, in the book of Matthew, when the Lord Jesus had been baptized by John the Baptist, the Spirit of the Lord had come upon him, and the Spirit of the Lord had driven him into the wilderness. Now, when he had gone to the wilderness, he was tempted by the devil. After, fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, we understand that the devil came to him. Now, when the devil came to him, that was a culmination of all the passions that have engaged him. The culmination was that Satan manifested. And when the devil had manifested, he interacted with the Lord. As part of the interaction, he said something very remarkable, which is important to this conversation that we are having. He said, "If you are the Son of God, if you are the Son of God, bow down and worship me. Bow down and worship me." But before he did that, he showed him all the kingdoms of this world and their glory. And then he told him that he should worship him, and then he would give him all these kingdoms of this world. But the basis of that temptation was always on the premise of him being the Son of God. So what is that title, Son of God? What does it mean? The first places in the Bible where we find the word the sons of God is Genesis chapter 6. And this whole part of the Bible had been subject to so many conversations. Even in this year, when I talked about demonology, I have dwelt so much on this conversation. And it's very important that we get to know about this. And in the coming ages and in the coming years that we are entering into a time, an opening where human consciousness is going to understand, to appreciate what exactly these sons of God are, especially 2024 going, which is this year into 2025 and the years ahead. We are going to see human consciousness, come to a point where they will be able to appreciate the idea of extraterrestrial realities, or what we call the sons of God, which I will explain. Because here we are dealing with traveling to other planets and all those things that Elon Musk and X is doing, SpaceX, they are doing it. In order for something things like that to happen, most of the time consciousness have to be addressed. And so the consciousness of man is going to be awakened to other realities aside human beings that are involved in the administration of kingdoms. And it is important that as Christians we become the first to know about these things, so that we can work with the beings of light who are at that level of administration. So in Genesis chapter 6, we find out the sons of God that saw the daughters of men, and then they slept with them. But the question is, why were they on the earth that they actually saw the sons of God? So Second Temple Jewish literature, what we call the apocryphal literatures, have historically talked about the watchers. In the book of Jubilee, it talked about the watchers, that God sent a group of beings to the earth to teach man righteousness. And you find that written in the book of Jubilee. Now, in Genesis 6, we find these sons of God, and in a much esotericism of reading of that text, you find out that they were actually sent to judge man. They were sent to judge the nations of the earth. Now, the word judge, we understand from the Torah that it deals with a ruling of a people. So these beings came or descended into our dimensional reality, which means our planet Earth, to administer as kings of the earth, to administer as what I had explained as principalities. So they were the principalities, but in this context, these principalities were physical. And there was this age on earth where there were corporal, that means supernatural beings that were the leaders of the nations of this earth. And God had instituted that age during during the age of Jasher, which means to descend. During that time, we see the activity of these beings, in terms of descending and entering into gross corporality. But we find that these beings descended to, sent by God to administrate as the rulers and the kings of the earth. And it is God that had given them that mandate, but they corrupted that mandate. Later on, we find how they corrupted it, and they established certain bloodlines, extraterrestrial bloodlines. And I wouldn't want to go into that conversation now. But the whole idea is, we find in Deuteronomy, and that is where I want to read Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 7 to 8. Now, like I said, there was an age, there was a time in the history of man that the sons of God were ruling the earth, much like how kings were ruling the earth, which means there was a time where supernatural beings were the leaders, or were the kings, or quote unquote presidents of nations. Isn't that awesome? You could find some of these things in the history books, some of these, mythical texts, this, text, myth. We find, people like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where we talked about other stories like Marduk and all these gods of nations that were described as, supernatural beings that were ruling the earth. So we find that this thing actually happened in history. There was a time that supernatural beings were literally on earth, and they were ruling the earth. Supernatural beings were actually administrating the earth, and it is God who had established this rule. However, we find out that they corrupted that mandate. So in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 7, and here we find, he said, remember the days of old. zakar. In Hebrew, when we talk about remembering, that means recollect. That means to recount. So it means that this thing had happened. And he's telling them to remember this time in history, the days of old. Consider the years of many generations, which means this thing has happened many years past. It had happened in a far more much older age period. Ask your father, he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nation, the word divided means shared inheritance to the nation. When he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. The Masoretic text explains that he sets the boundaries of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. But the Septuagint, which I find it amazing that when it comes to the supernatural environment of the Bible, the Masoretic text seems to conceal it. But when it comes to the Septuagint, it always, make it bare, explains it. And I think probably it was a much more intentional approach. The Jews have always tried to conceal mystery because they understand that mystery can corrupt when it is used wrongly. So they have always tried to conceal mystery, but open them up after being initiated. That means through baptism, when you begin to accept, the Jewish religion, that means the development of the faculties of moralities. When they see that these things are well prepared, the faculties of morality, what we call conscience, is prepared within you, then they will communicate to you the mysteries of the faith, which we will find a reiterating of such ideas even in Christianity. Paul has said, conscience, which some have abandoned, have made a shipwreck of the mysteries, or the faith, or the mysteries, the same thing, or the tradition, or the teachings, the same thing. So conscience is very important. So I believe that the Jewish nation intentionally concealed the mysteries, because the Masoretic text seems to be much more dealing with rabbinic Judaism. So they conceal the mysteries so that certain people can have access to it whose moral principles have not been developed. So we find here that he is saying, and I'm using the Septuagint, it says that God divided or set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of God. That is how the Septuagint reads it. So the watchers were given the administration of the earth. The administration, of the people of the earth. Not the earth, the people of the earth. So the sons of God had been given the administrating of the people of the earth, which are the watchers. So the watchers of Genesis 6 were given the administration of the people of the earth. So it means that the administration of nations is very supernatural. Is very, very supernatural. And that is something I want you to understand, that when we talk about thrones and nations, the thrones of nations are much older than the nation itself, because the thrones of nations are spirit beings. The spirits that rule that nation, these are the thrones of that nation. And the principles of rulership, or the principles upon which a person will rule that land, would have to be that it has to come from these spirits. That's interesting. Even in the times of the kings of Israel, we have seen that the Torah, a copy of the Torah, was given to the kings. And anytime they broke the Torah, God would have to come in to interrupt their administration, or their dominion over the nation, or their kingship. Either a nation will come and invade them, or he will kill them, or something bad would happen in their kingdom or in their realm. All because they have broken the principle upon which the throne is established. Okay, so their physical throne is established. And the principle upon which the physical throne is established is the spiritual throne. That spiritual being who is giving the administration of that people. So we understand that these watchers were sent by God to kind of frame. That means these are the beings that had created, that had formed the thrones of the nations. That means the earthly kings, the human kings, had actually sat on thrones created, framed by these beings. Thrones, the physical thrones or the thrones of the administration of nations were created by these spirits. And that's a very important thought. Very, very important thought. Now the question is, which means that God had allowed a race of beings because these beings do not come from the earth. And we understand from these extra biblical texts that they descended into our dimension, they interpenetrate our cosmic reality. But the question is, God opened those gates for them to interpenetrate our cosmic reality, which means these beings are extraterrestrials, which means the thrones that rule the nation is extraterrestrial in nature. Now, as to whether it is divine or diabolic, we will find out as we continue this conversation. But the most important thing to realize is that the thrones that govern the nations is extraterrestrial in nature, in origin. And God had allowed that. God had allowed certain beings to interpenetrate our dimension and frame thrones upon which the kings of the nations will sit on. So, for example, Samuel, we would say, is the first, you know, um, judge for the Jewish nation who actually framed the kingdom for Israel. So he is the one that created the throne upon which the Jewish nation will use. And he was a judge. And when you find out in much esotericism, he had received certain initiations, which we would also find out as we continue the conversation, that he had been awakened in his consciousness to come to a point that he had become an Elohim. Even in the spirit, when the witch of Endor had invoked and he had interrupted and appeared, he came as an Elohim, which means a watcher. So literally, we would say that he had developed his consciousness or through the principles or laws of divine transmogrification, he had changed himself to become a watcher. Hence, he had the power to also frame throne for the nation of Israel. So Samuel created the throne upon which the nation of Israel will use to institute their kings. That's amazing. So, like I'm saying, that spirits are the ones that rule the nations. Spirits are the ones that would rule the nations. Spirits are the ones that rule the nation. And these spirits are extraterrestrial in origin. And the question is, why would God give the administration of the nations to these beings? Why would God give the administration of the nation to these beings? So when God had divided the people, he had given the administration of these people to these watchers. In Genesis 6, we find that in Jubilee, it said they came to teach man righteousness, which means these beings had gone through an evolution that they have perfected their conformity to divine law. And as such, God found them fit to administrate man in teaching him righteousness, in teaching him the ways and principles of the divine. Isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing?